Welcome to Timeless Battles, where history meets mythology. Explore the epic stories of ancient wars, legendary heroes, and mythological gods from diverse cultures. The heavens themselves trembled as a dark cloud consumed the sky over Eternia. The stars flickered and dimmed, as if recoiling in fear of the entity approaching their world. No mortal or immortal had ever seen such an ominous presence. It was Darkseid, the Lord of Apokolips, the embodiment of tyranny and destruction, and his sights were set on the cosmic power of the universe known as the Sword of Power. He-Man, the mighty protector of Eternia, stood at the entrance of Castle Grayskull, sensing the arrival of an overwhelming force. His heightened senses told him this was no ordinary foe. This was an enemy whose very name struck terror across galaxies. As he gripped his enchanted sword, the power surged through his muscles, the very essence of Eternia itself coursing through him. Yet, for all the power He-Man commanded, he knew that to face Darkseid would test him like never before. Darkseid's army of parademons rained from the sky, their wings beating in unison like a storm of mechanical destruction. They swarmed the land, spreading fear and chaos. The citizens of Eternia cried out in panic, but He-Man was already on the move. With the power of Grayskull, he swung into action, fighting the parademons with the speed and might that had made him a legend. His sword cleaved through the air, cutting through his enemies. But there was an undeniable presence on the horizon, a force that could never be defeated by sheer strength alone. Darkseid descended from the sky, his colossal form silhouetted against the storm clouds. His eyes glowed with the fire of the Omega beams, and his deep, resonating voice shook the air as he spoke. He-Man, I have come for the one thing you value most, the power of Grayskull. Surrender, and I may allow your world to survive, Darkseid declared, his voice as cold and commanding as the void itself. He-Man's grip tightened on his sword as he stared down the tyrant. He had fought countless foes, from Skeletor to the Horde, but this was something different. Darkseid was not just a conqueror of worlds, he was the harbinger of destruction itself. But He-Man would not bow before him. His duty to Eternia and its people burned brighter than any fear that might rise within him. I am He-Man, and I will protect this world with my life, He-Man declared, his voice booming with confidence and strength. Darkseid's lips curled into a slight, menacing smile. He had dealt with so-called heroes before, but none had ever been so foolish as to defy him in such a way. Yet, He-Man's bravery was something that intrigued him. His strength, while impressive, would be no match for the might of the Omega beams. The conqueror of worlds would ensure that Eternia fell before him. He-Man charged forward, the air around him crackling with energy. The mighty hero swung his sword, aiming for Darkseid's chest, but the villain was too swift. In a blur of motion, Darkseid raised his hand and unleashed the destructive power of the Omega beams. They cut through the air, their deadly energy intent on erasing the hero from existence. He-Man, in a moment of sheer instinct, leapt to the side, narrowly dodging the beams that gouged deep furrows into the ground where he had stood moments before. His heart raced, but he knew he had no time to waste. The power of Grayskull was his greatest ally, and he needed to unleash it fully to stand a chance against the unstoppable force of Darkseid. With a roar, He-Man summoned the full might of the Sword of Power. Energy crackled from the blade, its light bright enough to rival the sun as he charged again, this time with the force of a thunderclap. Darkseid's eyes glowed as he prepared to unleash another wave of Omega beams. But He-Man was faster this time. With a swipe of his sword, he cleaved through the air, sending a powerful shockwave toward Darkseid, forcing the villain to stagger back. Darkseid's expression twisted with annoyance. Impressive, He-Man, but futile. You cannot defeat me. I am the embodiment of death, and your resistance is meaningless. He-Man stood his ground, sweat dripping from his brow. His body ached from the battle, but he would not surrender. With the power of Grayskull flowing through him, he struck again, this time with an even more powerful blow. Darkseid blocked it, with ease, but the force of the strike sent shockwaves through the air. It was clear to He-Man now, this would not be a battle of raw strength alone. He would need to outthink Darkseid, exploit any weaknesses, and hope that the power of Grayskull could give him the edge he needed. But Darkseid was a being of unimaginable power, and with every moment that passed, He-Man felt the weight of the battle growing heavier. The parademons swarmed around them, but he could feel something darker, something even more terrifying looming in the distance. Darkseid was not just here for a conquest. He was here to destroy everything He-Man loved. As the battle raged on, He-Man realized this might be the most dangerous foe he had ever faced. And he had to win, not just for Eternia, but for the very survival of all that he held dear. The battle raged on under the darkened sky. He-Man, fueled by the power of Grayskull, fought with relentless determination, each swing of his sword sending shockwaves across the battlefield. Yet, with each passing moment, it became clear that Darkseid was not only a physical force, but a master strategist, and He-Man's raw strength was beginning to wane. He-Man's sword clashed against Darkseid's armor, the force of each blow reverberating through the land. The Omega beams lashed out again and again, their power too intense to dodge for much longer. He-Man was swift, but not quick enough. Darkseid was everywhere at once, his power overwhelming, his mind calculating every move before it happened. With a roar of defiance, He-Man swung his sword with all his might, aiming for Darkseid's heart. But Darkseid simply raised his hand and in an instant unleashed the full force of the Omega beams. They hit He-Man head-on, the beams slicing through his armor, burning into his flesh, and sending him crashing to the ground with the force of an explosion. He-Man groaned, his body racked with pain, but he struggled to rise. The sword of power still lay by his side, but the very air around him seemed to conspire against him. The power he had called upon was now ebbing, leaving him vulnerable. His vision blurred, and he felt his strength fading, his connection to Grayskull weakening under the relentless assault. Darkseid stepped forward, his eyes glowing with triumph. "You fought valiantly, He-Man, but your efforts were in vain. Eternia will fall, as every world before it has fallen. The power of the anti-life equation will erase all hope. And you..." He paused, a cruel smile twisting on his lips. "You will serve me." He-Man struggled to lift his sword, but his body was no longer responding. The Omega beams had taken their toll. The world around him felt as if it was slipping away. His fingers trembled as they brushed the hilt of the sword, but it was clear his fight was over. "No!" He-Man roared, summoning every last ounce of his willpower. He raised his sword once more, but Darkseid's voice boomed in response, resonating with the finality of a doomed world. "You cannot win. You never could. The anti-life equation has already begun its work. You are powerless against it." As Darkseid's words settled in He-Man's mind, a sense of despair washed over him. He had given everything, his strength, his resolve, his soul, and still, it was not enough. His vision darkened, and the world around him began to fade into nothingness. The Omega beams had not only destroyed his body, but were now draining the very essence of his being. Darkseid watched with cold indifference as He-Man fell to the ground, his once immense power now reduced to nothing. The mighty hero of Eternia defeated. "You were a worthy adversary," Darkseid said, stepping over He-Man's fallen form. "But you were never meant to stand against me." Darkseid raised his hand, and with it, the skies above Eternia darkened even further. A massive pulse of energy rippled out, and the world seemed to shudder. The land groaned under the weight of Darkseid's power, and the parademons, having already overwhelmed the citizens of Eternia, turned their attention to the final remnants of resistance. Eternia was now fully under Darkseid's control. As He-Man lay motionless on the ground, something stirred within him. Despite the overwhelming power of Darkseid, despite the seemingly inevitable destruction of Eternia, a faint flicker of hope remained deep within He-Man's heart. Though Darkseid had won this battle, the light of Grayskull was not so easily extinguished. For now, He-Man was defeated. But as long as there was breath in his body, as long as there was hope in the hearts of those he protected, there would always be a chance to rise again. Darkseid's laughter echoed through the battlefield, the sound of a conqueror who had finally claimed what was his. But as He-Man's form began to fade into unconsciousness, the hero's last thoughts were not of despair. He had failed to save Eternia today, but the fight was not over. There would always be another battle, another chance, and Darkseid would not escape the wrath of He-Man forever.